The state could double the size of a giant project that would send Mississippi River water into the marsh. The Mid-Breton sediment diversion would aim to build new land.
In a special Coast in Crisis report, John Snell tells us about this high-stakes mud fight.
Nearly an hour before sunrise, a crabber pushes away from the dock. A scene that plays out along Louisiana's 7,000 linear miles of coast. Oystermen and shrimpers ply the waters of America's Great Delta. But Nico Tesvich and his fellow fishermen work along some of the fastest disappearing land on the planet.
What's at stake here?
A way of life. A culture, families, futures.
He and many other fishermen doubt the state's solution, arguably the most elaborate environmental restoration ever attempted. Key to that effort, the plan to unleash the Mississippi River, now caged in levees, reconnect it to the Delta, and build new land.
The fundamental issue really facing Louisiana is a lack of sediment input.
The Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has applied for federal permits to build 2 giant diversions on each bank of the river and feed sediment into the marsh, together roughly $2 billion. CPRA announced it will study more than doubling the size of the East Bank diversion to match the one on the West Bank, up to 75,000 cubic feet per second, enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in just over 1 second. One of the great ironies of the 2010 BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico was the windfall it created for South Louisiana, upwards of $9 billion for various coastal projects, including paying for the largest among them.
Throughout history, you have plans and no money, or you have some money and no plans and you waste it, right? We actually have really good plans and we have money. That almost never happens.
These projects are nothing but a money pit.
But many fishermen like Kendra Aronson and Nico Tesvich cringe at the idea.
We need to embrace the saltwater marsh we have and do what we can to keep it around, not kill it with a bunch of fresh water.
They fear not just the fresh water, but nutrients, fertilizers washed downstream from parts of 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces.
Look at what Carnarvon's done on the east side. Go talk to the fishermen over there. Carnarvon's destroyed the east side. Opponents
point to the existing smaller Carnarvon freshwater diversion. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina rolled up the nearby marsh and converted 1/3 of the estuary to open water.
And we should recognize that, and I think should expect that we're going to have more damages. I mean, we don't have a successful example.
LSU's Dr. Eugene Turner is an exception among coastal scientists. The majority side with the state, but Turner points to research showing marsh grass roots get weaker when subjected to pollution from nutrients.
And the larger you do this on the river, the larger the project on the river, the more things you have to have built in to take care of uncertainties. So we've never done this, so there have to be uncertainties.
River levees isolated that marsh for 80 years, and CPRA Executive Director Bren Haas says that may have contributed to the weak soils.
You know, when you have an event like that, extraordinary things are going to happen.
Supporters say just look at satellite maps, which show the Carnarvon diversion building land today, even though it was never designed to do so. It was only supposed to change salinity. Or Wax Lake, south of Morgan City, where the Atchafalaya River spits out a brand new delta.
But I think it's a little less black and white than we've never done this before. We know a lot about what the river does. We know a lot about how it can build land.
Critics want to rely more on dredging to build instant land, suck mud from the water bottoms, and mold the coast to our liking.
You can take a bucket or a million buckets of dirt and put it somewhere, and that's where it is.
The state has spent hundreds of millions of dollars dredging. But scientists argue the same forces chewing at the coast today eventually erase that new land, that any long-term strategy must push back the salt.
So the bigger threat, the science says, is to lose the marsh altogether, because we lose the habitat altogether, and then we don't have fisheries.
Katrina drove home the stakes for everyone. as Louisiana steadily loses its islands, ridges, and swamps, natural defenses.
This is a threat to 2 million people who live and work along the coast.
Governor John Bel Edwards recently vowed the state will work hard to identify risk from diversions, but says the state will follow the science.
But we are going to move forward because there is a sense of urgency.
They're talking about opening something the size of the Mobile River into the heart of the estuary that is the barrier between the Gulf of Mexico and New Orleans. People in New Orleans better wake up.
I'm absolutely convinced of the power of the river and that this will work.
The state says it's only studying doubling the East Bank project, but just the possibility intensifies history's most expensive mud fight. John Snell, Fox 8 Local First. So much of the coastal community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles has washed away, the government now offers to relocate residents. Scientists blame a variety of factors for the land loss, from sinking land disconnected from the Mississippi River to oil field canals. Johnny Tamplay has watched as the land here peeled away before his eyes.
It's changed the marsh completely.
To get equipment in place and tap into Louisiana's riches, the industry carved 35,000 oil canals through the marsh.
It's enough to go around the Earth 3/4 of the distance around the Earth at the equator.
In the vast majority of cases, the canals leading to abandoned or capped wells were never plugged or backfilled. Google Earth Maps dramatize how they slice and dice the marsh and radically change the tidal flow.
It really interferes with the water movements in and out of the marsh.
LSU's Dr. Eugene Turner says the issue is not so much the canal itself as the canal banks, which block the inches of water that move over and through the marsh. The water driven by tides must find a way around those canals. Like overwatering your lawn, the marsh alternately floods, then goes through periods of drought.
Below ground, it's also compressed the soil beneath, so the water doesn't go below ground like it used to either.
Think of it as a sponge. The spill banks press down on parts of the marsh, blocking the water flow below the surface. The vast majority of the canals have been left untouched. Turner studied some exceptions, 33 that have been filled in over the years. Check out this before example compared to that spot after the spoil bank was returned to the level of the marsh and nature rebuilt the land, and the two together.
Some of them have worked. I mean, they clearly have worked. They're filled in.
The mud is not enough to fill the canal, and Turner cautions it will take time, maybe a couple decades, for the land to naturally build back. But by coastal restoration standards, it's cheaper.
You could do it for $330 million. That's pretty small compared to the amount of money that people have gotten out of these wetlands.
Consider the state spent more than $200 million building one 13-mile beach project near Grand Isle. Turner's idea amounts to less than 1% of the state's 50-year master plan for restoring the coast.
Backfilling of canals is certainly a legitimate form of restoration.
Bren Haas, the state's #2 coastal official, points to a project in the Jean Lafitte National Park on the West Bank to drag down 16 miles of canal banks. The settlement with Transocean, the rig owner involved in the 2010 Gulf oil spill, pays for the work.
I don't think it's unanimously accepted as the best thing, since sliced bread, I guess.
Haas says the state is open to looking at more of the projects, but argues there are a lot of complications finding and dealing with landowners. Some people like the access the canals provide. Filling in these canals seems like a simple enough thing, but remember, many of them were dug decades ago. The spoil banks here are 4, 5, 6 feet high in places, and many of them lined with trees. Ironically, some people even think of them as a bit of hurricane protection.
It's not a natural ridge, but it is an elevated, piece of land that can serve as a bit of a speed bump.
Some areas, of course, are gone. But for the areas that have some marsh around them and that still have a canal there, it's still a good thing to do.
Turner stopped short of attempting to answer who should pay for it.
Well, it would have been a lot better in 1930 to fill them in.
He believes the state could start small, 100 canals, to see what happens. John Snell, Fox 8 Local First. Water. It built the land we live on. The water drops from parts or all of 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Through the centuries, the Mississippi delivered mountains of sediment, sculpting America's Great Delta. On the east bank of Plaquemines Parish, coastal scientist Dr. John Lopez takes us into Big Mar, decades ago an agricultural area. After the levees failed, Big Mar was a square lake, but satellite images show it transforming.
Most of what was that lake is now a delta.
Lopez credits sediment, tiny bits of sand and dirt flowing through the nearby Carnarvon freshwater diversion.
Starting around 2005, we started seeing new wetlands developing, and actually there's now a small delta.
He points out Carnarvon was never designed to build land, only to deliver a fresh drink to the nearby marsh. To the fishermen who ply these waters, like Ryan Guerra, that sounds like something from a different universe.
They just can't live in that fresh water. They ain't gonna live.
They blame trillions of gallons from the Bonnie Carey spillway for wiping out their catch, a combination of fresh water and nutrients from fertilizer, runoff from farms primarily in the Midwest.
Ain't nobody listening. I think they want to knock us out, get us out of here.
So you have a massive amount of water, much more than the rate that is proposed for any of the diversions.
The state wants federal permits to build 2 sediment diversions, totaling about $2 billion, with the aim of building or sustaining thousands of acres.
They die off, we are next.
Dr. Moby Solangi at the Institute for Marine Mammal Studies in Gulfport blames the Bonnie Carey for widespread dolphin deaths this year.
The issue that we are dealing with is much more serious than the BP oil spill.
The system right now is almost completely flushed with fresh water, almost to the Gulf of Mexico. So that is not what's proposed, and I do think it's an unfair comparison.
Lopez says fresh water may very well be a factor, but argues it's too early for scientists to jump to conclusions about what's killing the dolphins. The two sides of the argument oftentimes point to the same places on the map to make their case. While supporters say just look at that new Carnarvon Delta, critics point to Breton Sound, where Hurricane Katrina steamrolled over the marsh, wiping out a huge swath of land in a matter of hours. Charter boat captain George Rick cites some studies that suggest the Carnarvon diversion turned a saltwater system fresh and more vulnerable to storm surge.
See the root systems how short? It should be a lot longer than that.
Still others point out the marsh in that area, made largely out of organic material, was collapsing long before Katrina, as oil-field canals sliced and diced the marsh, drawing in salt water and ruining the tidal flow. Lopez also points back to Carnarvon.
This area right here, these trees, these cypress trees we planted in 2012 were covered by 18 feet of salt water, and they did perfectly fine.
The stakes could scarcely be higher as scientists and engineers look to redo the plumbing on America's great river.
Imagine planting 1 million tree seeds at one time in an area smaller than many subdivisions. That's what the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation recently attempted.
John Snell reports on traditional and not so traditional efforts to bring back Louisiana's cypress forests and nature's natural hurricane defenses in this Coast in Crisis report.
Volunteers give up a Saturday morning to sow a little hope.
Our kids and our kids' will see a big change, and hopefully this land we can save.
Near Montague in Terrebonne Parish, more than 150 people plant young cypress trees on the site of a now dead forest.
That's the first thing you notice coming out here was a lot of the dead trees.
These 2,000 trees are the last of 30,000 the America's Wetland Foundation and its partners have planted nearby.
These are what we consider transitional projects. These are the projects that are going to help hold the line as the larger projects happen.
The skeletons of old cypress stand in the distance, victims of saltwater intrusion. A new levee will keep out the salt and give this generation a chance.
And over the past 50 years, I've seen the state wash away before my own eyes. You travel down south and you see the vast open waterways that were once land.
Logging also wiped out much of Louisiana's old growth a century ago and some of nature's best defenses. Today, there are still some places where you can step back in time into ancient Louisiana.
Cypress will live hundreds years, even 1,000 years or more.
Nature intends for a tiny fraction of the cypress cones to survive, but when they beat the odds, they can grow into giants. The largest living thing east of the Sierra Nevada mountains resides north of St. Francisville in a swamp preserved as a national refuge. Dr. John Lopez of the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation takes us to a few spots near the Plaquemines-St. Bernard Parish line where they grow a new forest.
But a tree like this is really very effective in terms of storm surge. Lopez
says even a 5 to 15 foot tall tree will start to provide some buffer against hurricanes. What began as a modest effort to plant a few trees is converting a landscape. Over the last 6 years or so, the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation and its partners have planted 30,000 trees out here, mostly bald cypress. They estimate 20,000 of them survive today. All of these plantings involve challenges. Feral hogs can trample young trees. Nutria can wipe out an entire planting.
The first planting we did here years ago, we did not use protectors, and we had 100% loss of the trees.
Today, most of the plantings involve installing a Nutria protector.
It's just a sheet of plastic that we make a cylinder, and we put that around the tree.
After a few years, the tree bursts out of the protector when it's big enough that Nutria no longer pose a threat. Despite these strides, Lopez says at the current pace of plantings, it would take roughly 1,000 years to replace Louisiana's cypress forests.
In some of these areas, the swamps have been so decimated, there aren't trees there to produce a new crop of trees.
So they're trying it on an industrial scale. Last year, in a test program, they dropped seeds by commercial seeding plane near Pass Manchac. Thousands and thousands of seeds.
When we plant trees, we plant about 200 trees per acre. When we're dropping seed, we're dropping on the order of 5,000 seeds per acre.
Most of the cypress cones won't survive, and it'll take a couple years to know if a significant number of the trees take root. But Lopez says it could drop the cost of plantings by 99%.
It'll take a long time to get the majestic swamp that we once had.
They'll do 3 more plantings this year. And who knows, maybe tiny cypress seeds will grow into giants. John Snell, Fox 8 Local First.
Workers are racing against time to try and wrap up a first-of-its-kind island restoration project.
Near Grand Isle, they are piecing back together Queen Bess Island, a vital nesting spot for the brown pelican. John Snell explains the project and where the state got the money in a special Coast and Crisis report.
Pelicans crowd the skies above Louisiana's Queen Bess Island, and each spring, their population explodes. The Louisiana brown pelican rates as one of conservation's great success stories. Virtually wiped out half a century ago, today biologists say the state bird numbers close to 50,000. But Queen Bess is steadily sinking and eroding. During breeding season, a few thousand pelicans cling to 5 acres of real estate, surrounded by a rock barrier installed in the 90s.
Queen Bess was in the bullseye of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
Now, fines from the 2010 Gulf spill pay for the island's revival. A $10 million project now underway creates instant land, raising the height of the island. Todd Baker is a wildlife and fisheries biologist.
It's really special. You don't get opportunities to do what we're doing here.
Limestone will cover about a third of the island for other species looking for beachfront property.
He's reaching over, he's getting a big bucket full of sand.
Project manager Katie Freer-Leonards explains they dredge the sand from the Mississippi River near Belchase, then barge it to the site.
The excavator at this end is moving the sand out of the way, basically creating channels so that the slurried sand material goes in the direction that they want it to go.
This This entire effort is about 36 acres. By coastal restoration standards, that's not a big project, but they do have a short window of time. You can't bring heavy equipment into a nursery. So construction had to wait until most of the pelicans had left the island this year. On the day we visited, one lone bird hung out close to its nest near the dredge pipe. Contractors must wrap up their work before the birds start nesting again in the spring.
It doesn't leave a lot of room for error.
We've never really done a project like this in Louisiana.
It's tough to overstate the importance of this island to the brown pelican population.
The vast majority of brown pelicans are found on only a few islands.
Eric Johnson, the director of bird conservation for Audubon, Louisiana, points out 70% of the pelican chicks hatch in 3 colonies, including Queen Bess. A battle of land and sea defines Louisiana's coast. As the Mississippi River shifted course over the centuries, it sculpted a new delta. But land in the old delta lobe steadily broke into pieces, forming islands just far enough removed from predators to create a pelican paradise. Today, man locks the river in a straitjacket of levees.
There aren't new islands being created fast enough to replace the ones that are disappearing.
10 years ago, pelicans in Louisiana nested in 22 colonies. Today, 14 remain. Many of the smaller ones disappeared, including 4 of the Cat Islands in Plaquemines Parish, heavily oiled in the BP spill. That means the pelicans must crowd onto a smaller set of remaining islands.
This creates a lot of potential, the potential for disasters because of hurricanes, oil spills, and those sorts of things. So since 2005, their population has leveled, and that is not what we would have expected given the previous trajectory of exponential growth.
By next year, Queen Bess should support more birds.
If everything goes as we hope it will, the nesting population could increase out here 4 or 5-fold.
One positive sign, so many of the pelicans are hanging around the island, even through all this commotion. Nothing, though, guarantees it will work.
What we do know is if we do nothing, this nesting habitat is gone.
John Snell, Fox 8, Local First.
Pelicans stopped nesting in the 1950s following the widespread use of the pesticide DDT, which was later banned. Biologists reintroduced the birds to Louisiana in 1968.
Nowhere else in America will you find a scene quite like this. Giant dredges chew at the Mississippi River bottom. Like a fleet of giant vacuums, they keep the mighty river open to ship traffic. It takes place near the mouth of the Mississippi in the Bird's Foot Delta.
It's been an iconic feature on the Louisiana map since some of the first settlers.
Iconic or not, the Bird's Foot Delta is conspicuously absent from the state's master plan for coastal restoration, sacrificed largely on the belief that future sea level rise could very well doom this area. With limited resources, the state focuses on levees or coastal projects closer to where people live.
In every battle, there's a front line. This is the front line.
But the Army Corps of Engineers is spending close to $200 million this year, keeping the river channel deep enough for navigation. Since 2009, sand and dirt has been sent by pipe into the nearby marsh in areas of 2 or 3 feet of water.
We have mud here where we would like water for navigation, and we have water here where we like mud for wildlife and marine habitat. And they only separate by about 100 feet. It's very simple.
The widely held belief is that Louisiana is wasting all this dirt, throwing away land, parts of more than 30 states and 2 Canadian provinces. The Corps estimates it captures about 53% of that sediment that otherwise would fall off the outer continental shelf. It's restored 8,500 acres of wetlands, an area 20 times roughly the size of the French Quarter. Technically, there have been many projects over the years, but if you consider this to be one effort,
I call this the largest wetlands restoration project in the world.
Sean Duffy, a maritime industry representative, says he's tried to find a bigger example.
Since I've been saying that this last year, nobody's told me I was number 2 or number 3. Nobody's argued.
On the day we visited, giant hopper dredges were hitting hot spots where sediment was piling up in the river, while other dredges were piping that black gold into a state wildlife management area.
It's striking, as a matter of fact, the amount of species that have come up on this pump in 1 year.
In an area with very little elevation, wildlife biologist Arthur Hebert says any new habitat benefits nesting birds and other critters.
This time 2 years ago, these areas weren't even here, so there would have been no nesting in these areas.
Steering large ships around all those vessels is no small feat. It can take hours of planning to coordinate traffic.
The cutterhead has a lot of equipment, and it actually takes up half the channel as well. So it's like putting an 18-wheeler on Britannia Street.
This is something that the typical person in Louisiana wouldn't even be aware of unless they came out here to the location to see it.
The levees that confine the Mississippi generally starve the delta of fresh water and sediment. Here's one case where man is giving back some of that land. John Snell, Fox 8 Local First.
For decades, Louisiana has fought to get the rest of the country to pay attention to the loss of the coast.
Yeah, it scored one victory 30 years ago, a program that still pumps millions of dollars into projects. John Snell talks with the man who pushed that through Congress, former Senator John Breaux.
On the Plaquemines Parish West Bank, a dredge pipe spits out new land. At a state wildlife refuge southwest of Lafayette, a first-of-its-kind shoreline project protects 3 miles of coast. Near Lafitte, crews reconstruct a ridge that had disappeared. These and a couple hundred other projects around South Louisiana drew their funding from a program that's not exactly a household name and is a mouthful: the Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection, and Restoration Act of 1990, or the Breaux Act. From a boat launch under the I-10 west of Kenner, 75-year-old former U.S. Senator John Breaux takes a short airboat ride into the nearby marsh to look in on one of the very first of these projects.
This was open water.
In 1994, the Army Corps dredged mud from Lake Pontchartrain and pumped it into the LaBranche wetlands.
And we'll actually move that pipeline
and just spray it just like a hose. You spray it.
Brad Inman, the chief of the Corps Restoration Branch, says it created nearly 500 acres of land.
It actually, when it was done, and we look at that 20 years, it actually had more wetlands here than what we predicted from a landmass standpoint.
And it shows you how beautiful Louisiana is and how it can be in the future. But if we don't have projects like this, some of this Louisiana is going to break off and go out into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's never coming back.
Back in 1990, there was no permanent source of money, zero funding that could be counted on to address the loss of Louisiana's coast.
And a hurricane comes and it goes, but I mean, wetland erosion is a silent hurricane that continues on and on and on.
John Breaux found a funding source in an excise tax on fishing equipment and small engine and motorboat fuel. A fraction of a penny goes to Louisiana, but collected nationally, that now adds up to about $70 million a year.
The normal way of getting money is to go through the appropriations process, go to the appropriations committee every year and get a program funded. Maybe it got funded, maybe it didn't.
This bill went around the normal appropriations process to tap into a regular stream of money. But that wasn't the only issue. There was politics.
The federal government and the state were always fighting over jurisdiction.
For that matter, federal agencies each carried their own, often competing responsibilities. The Interior Department wanted marsh. Marine Fisheries looked out for fish habitat. Turf wars could stall projects. The solution was to put the agencies on the same committee, a federal and state task force that decides what projects to approve.
So they were forced to work together.
Congress passed the law with support from Democrats and Republicans, and President George H.W. Bush signed it into law. In divided Washington today, could you do this kind of a project?
Maybe not. I think that, it's changed a lot. People, instead of trying to find common ground, are willing to fight each other. and politically and personally, and that's a sad state of affairs.
The BRO Act, or QIPRA as it's often called today, is no comprehensive solution. It funds small or medium-sized projects, not the massive barrier island restorations or larger projects the state envisions today. Planners say, though, that it taught them lessons about how to restore the coast.
I look at it and I say, this is my state. I mean, this is part of Louisiana, and I'm glad we're helping to make sure that it's there for our future generations.
That project in the LaBranche wetlands has outlived its expected 20-year lifespan. The task force is now looking at an even bigger project next door, funded through the BRO Act. John Snell, Fox 8 Local First.